Welcome back, everyone, to another exciting episode of Rick and Nick's Excellent Adventure. And we have got a heavy topic for you today. We are months into 2024, but we're still breaking down the awesome research that came out of 2023 from Edutopia, which every year does a summary of some of the best articles and meta studies. And Rick is going to open up today by summarizing a new theory about the teen mental health crisis. And right before we went on the air with this one, we were talking about how we could literally do a 5-hour episode on this article alone. So Rick's going to really hit us with some very, very salient points. And then we're going to kind of talk and workshop and break down a lot of what's in this article here. So some great stuff to talk about, and about probably the most serious matter concerning the field of education and youth today. Rick?
Yeah, for sure, Nick. Thanks for that intro. Yeah, the name of the article that Edutopia was kind of summarizing here is one of the 10 most important research studies of 2023. The name of that article is Decline in Independent Activity as a Cause of Decline in Children's Mental Well-Being. It's a summary of the evidence. And the researchers there are Gray, Lancy, and Borkland, 2023. So that's the article if you want to kind of look that up in yourself, maybe like Google Scholar or something like that. But let me give you the kind of quick summary. These researchers I just mentioned, theorized that a primary cause of the mental health crisis is a decline over decades in opportunities for children and teens to play, roam, and engage in other activities independent of direct oversight and control by adults. So mic drop, bam, there it is. That's the premise. That's the hypothesis, really, that they put together for us here, Nick. We know there's lots of causes, but they're suggesting that something we've overlooked, kind of as we've kind of dug through, social media and the challenges there and the COVID crisis. They're not discounting that those things are important and have had a detrimental effect, but their suggestion is this is an important thing that nobody's kind of looking at, and they make a really strong argument. I'll dig through some of the pieces of this to kind of give you some more detail and depth. Initial thoughts on this one, Nick, as you kind of read through kind of the summary for yourself?
I think it's going to be really important to hear some of the highlights of the research here. But we've talked about this multiple times during the podcast before, especially during the 40 developmental assets.
Yeah.
So this is not new for either of us or our listeners. But I think it's interesting to hear some of the research bits, and I'm curious as to which ones you've picked out to highlight here. So I'm going to save my comments for there.
Yeah, sounds good. Let me give you a few of the pieces here from it. So let me just start with some of the research that they're kind of in the lit review piece that I think is important for us to kind of recognize, because we all kind of, like pop psychology would say, oh, mental health's getting worse. It's getting worse. Is it really getting worse? And the answer to that is, oh yeah, researchers, have looked closely at this, and we've determined that, yeah, it's getting a lot worse, and it's gotten a lot worse, not only over the past 10 years because of COVID, but we're looking at something that's gotten worse over the past 50 to 60 years. As researchers have looked at mental health, depression, anxiety, what used to be kind of diagnostic criteria for anxiety, right, disorders, and for depression is now normal for up to 85% of the youth population. Let that sit a minute, right? What used to be 50 years ago a diagnostic criteria for depression and diagnostic anxiety is now a normal level for about 85% of the general population of kids. That's significant, right? That's significant, and this article talks a lot about that. And so let me get to a few more pieces here. A large decline over decades in children's opportunities for independent activity, and a large decline over the same decades in young people's mental health. Basically, what they're saying is there's a correlation here, right? Is kids are having less time to kind of independently roam and play and create, right? And at the same time, we've seen this really precipitous decline over the past 50 years in mental health. And what they're suggesting is maybe it's more than just a correlation. Maybe these two things are connected, and this is a contributing factor to why kids are not doing well, kind of their mental health and well-being. Let me read a little bit more. There is kind of a caveat here when the researchers kind of note that in some respects, kids actually have a little bit more autonomy than they have in the past, but those are really kind of isolated to things like what kids wear. They have more autonomy and freedom, and what they eat. More autonomy and freedom. I even recognized that from my own growing up. I had to eat what was served for dinner, and now I spoil my kids with what they want to eat often, even if that's different than what the family eats. I'm not suggesting that parents do that, but that's something that I do, and my kids kind of experience more freedom in that regard than I did. But what has declined specifically is children's freedom to engage in activities that involve some degree of risk and personal responsibility away from adults. The first half of the 20th century you could describe as the golden age of unstructured play. And it shows how children's free play, especially outdoors, has declined from 1960 moving forward. One more piece here, and then I'll stop to get some thoughts. Researchers report and parents report that their children's play independently and outdoors far less than they themselves did as children, and that they also limit their children's freedom outdoors largely because of fears of crime and traffic and their kids getting hurt. So, what do you think? Any kind of reactions to any of that, Nick?
I was muted.
Sorry.
I didn't want you to hear me. I was chewing ice while you were reading because I didn't want it to disturb. It harkens me back. I can't help but think about some of the articles that came out about, I guess it was 10 years ago now, involving free range parenting. Do you remember any of those?
Yeah,
they were
for sure.
a series of articles about some families in New York City that would let their kids kind of roam free in Central Park and things like that. And I think a lot of people missed the point on what those articles were trying to say. And what I think they were trying to say was what we're seeing in this research now. And that is, we have generationally taken away a lot of freedom of exploration and creativity from our kids. And it's not because the notion of wanting to keep our kids safe is wrong. Like the fears that we have of children being safe and things like that. Yes, it's over exaggerated. Yes, the concepts of lawnmower parents and helicopter parents and everything else is true. And and all of that is a major problem. However, we still would have been and could have been and can provide all of the freedoms and opportunities for our children to explore, create, do all the things they need to do to have the ability to grow the way that they had, the way the decline has been happening over the past 50 to 60 years, or whichever way we want to look at it there. I don't feel like when you look at the memes and you look at the things on social media that say, it was so much better in the 80s, the 90s, etc., the 70s, whichever however we want to read that. It's just that the technology has evolved, parenting styles have evolved, and I'm not saying that's good or bad, but that's what's happened. So we can't blame the children for these things. And that's really where the point I want to make comes in here. So what I want to emphasize as we look at this is that what starts to happen, and maybe this is because of the age we are at right now, Rick, is that I can start to see the generational divide in teachers, from the younger teachers who are just starting out their careers, the middle career teachers, and end of career teachers. And when you look at some of the end of career teachers, there's a subset of them who have the belief that kids have changed. And my strong opinion is that no, kids have not changed. The way we have parented those kids have changed. The way that we have socialized and civilized those kids have changed. That is not their doing. That is not their quote unquote fault. That's not their responsibility. We did that. So it's our responsibility to figure out how to adjust, course correct, monitor, whatever we want to look to do to get an outcome that is either similar, different, or whatever we're looking for specifically in that regard. Goes back to the Karate Kid, where Mr. Miyagi says there's no such thing as a bad student, only a bad teacher. And by teacher, he's not meaning a teacher in school. He means any kind of mentor, guardian, parent, whatever there. So I will shut my mouth now and please continue.
Yeah, no, Nick, that's a great point, because if you look at kind of videos and TikToks and stuff that kind of suggest that this generation is a bunch of snowflakes. And what you're suggesting, I think, is true. But look, there may be a difference. I think there is a difference between kids now and kids 30 years ago. But I think we'd be careful as adults for like pointing fingers and saying, you snowflakes. That finger ought to come back at us and say, oh, what? Or did we do something to kind of that's causing and contributing to this? Do we need to, as you said, course correct? Is there something? And I think that's what this article is all about, is saying, look, there might be good reasons why. And that last piece that I kind of read there was, look, a lot of parents do kind of keep their kids inside and hover because they're worried about their safety, right? I mean, we know some of the statistics now of the number of kids, one in 4 females and 1 in 6 boys who were sexually molested before the time they hit 18. Oh my gosh, I got 4 kids. I want to hover over them to make sure that they're not part of a statistic, right? I get that for sure. But in that process of hovering, of kind of, keeping control, right? We've talked a lot about control in the show, that we're giving up something, that there's an effect that maybe is something that's, not all that helpful or potentially even harmful. And I think that's kind of what this article has suggested, is we need to be careful about our hovering, about our protectiveness, about our over planning for kids, right? We're going to make sure that they have, they're always playing a sport, or they're doing an instrument, or they're in some kind of vocal lesson, or they're in the arts, all year long, to make sure that they've got productive activities to do. It's like, and what this research is saying, be careful. There might be some good things to that. In fact, we've talked about good things to that kind of engagement.
Yes.
But there's another side to it. It also might, kind of stunt certain creativity and growth in other ways. And that play, the opportunity for play and for critical and creative thinking to grow and to foster, we might be sacrificing some of that stuff. That's what this research is suggesting. And I think, and when we sacrifice some of those aspects, what we see is an negative effect on mental health, right? That's what we're getting to, is maybe that's part of why we're having these kind of really escalated numbers in depression and anxiety, because kids don't have the same opportunities to creatively play. And we can argue and say, again, well, no, they don't, because we're trying to protect them. But again, okay, but we're still seeing an effect there. And so is there a course correction? Or is there a way to accommodate that piece while still keeping kids safe? There's no easy answers here. This article is just suggesting there might be a problem with the way we're raising kids right now. And we ought not to be pointing fingers towards the kids and saying, they're wrong. We feel good about how we were in the 80s. Like, wait a minute. We're the ones potentially who have contributed to this.
Yes, absolutely. Well said.
Nick, the first thing I thought of when I read this article was Stranger Things. And how, right, these kids growing up in the 80s and they're riding bikes all over town. I'm like, when I watched, Stranger Things with my daughters for the first time, I was like, yeah, that's how it used to be. It was just to go ride bikes around town, right? Because you could, and it was fun, and you had that freedom, and you could kind of, go out in the woods and pretend you were kind of Lord of the Rings or whatever it might be, just kind of like the kids in that show. And that's different even, right? From so many kids today. And I think it's one of the neat things about that show is to kind of pull that back and show that this is the way things used to be, but it's very different than the way things are now.
It is. And if you can draw that out a little bit further and look at the example of, they call it the generation of kids in the workforce now, whether it's the millennial or whatever the name for the generation is. And they were the childhood walkthrough of, everyone got a trophy, right? Like that whole, complaint philosophy.
Yep.
And it's like, well, why is this generation of workers, why do they need to be coddled so much? Why do they need to be stroked? Why do they feel the need? And you're like, well, if you look back and you say this was a group that we felt like everyone needed to be rewarded or treated a certain way, whether you believe that or don't believe that, the point being is actions lead to reactions, actions lead to consequences, and that could be one way to look at that. Now, that's not saying having all of those freedoms in the 80s was a good thing necessarily, right? Like, hey, there's plenty of bad that came out of that too.
For sure.
At the say, so maybe what we're looking for is a balance, perhaps, or just the notion again that we need to continually be reflective of our parenting practices and our teaching practices, and continually turning the lens back onto ourselves, and not putting the blame on, a child who is supposed to be the clay that we are shaping.
Yeah. Yeah, and Nick, you say that we're not only just talking about parenting styles, but we're also talking about education, right? Because I think education is an important piece here as well. Because if you really think about it, we're taking kids who are naturally creative, who kind of grow up in a world of make believe and pretend, and right, which is so. I mean, look, developmental psychologists will tell you that's gold in preschool. That's gold. We want kids to kind of play in that imaginary play. That's how they learn to interact and live and develop morals and social skills. I mean, there's so many positives that come from that playing. But what happens was we kind of take them through the school. We kind of snuff that out. Now that we have our reasons for doing it, but we do. What we do is we take kind of the divergent thinking model to. I'm sorry, we take the divergent thinking model to the convergent thinking model. Which when there's a problem, there's one correct answer. That's the way our tests are designed, right? There's one correct
Yep.
answer. And if you don't pick the one out of the 5 on the multiple choice, you're wrong. There's one way to think about this. And all of our testing does just that as kids make their way through school, right? And you say, what happens to kids' creativity? Well, some of it, I think we socialize out of them because we're looking for them to kind of conform, conform. Rather than kind of be creative and express and create things. And so I think that's part of this. I was reminded that I was teaching a class this week, Nick, with some school counselors, and we were doing assessments. We were sharing assessments with each other. And one of my students presented the Torrance tests of creativity. And I was a little bit familiar with them, but it was a really good reminder of what the Torrance tests of creativity do. And they do just this. They test creativity and say, oh, there's some value in the test and the results. But I think the real value in that is kind of reinforcing the need to reinforce creativity with kids. Because the questions on the assessment were something like this. List as many, given 5 minutes, list as many possible uses for a brick as you can. And allowing
Love it.
kids and reinforcing and emphasizing the importance of just letting your mind expand and be creative, kind of coming up with novel, unique kind of scenarios and situations, right? Kids have the cognitive capacity to do that. In fact, they want to do those kind of things when they're kind of at the end of elementary through middle school. They're ready for those hypothetical kind of thinking. They like doing that, right? But where they love doing riddles, right? It's one of the fun things to do with kind of late elementary, middle school is let's give them some riddles and see how creative they can think, right? And that enjoy that kind of playing with this new toy they have up in their brain. And well, that was one of the kind of questions. And another one was, it was the scribble test. Write a couple scribbles and let have a kid make a picture out of the scribbles you gave them, right? As a test for creativity. And another one was giving them a series of pictures that were unique in some way and allowing them to kind of create a story to explain what they saw in the picture. So one of the pictures is there's a car like that has crashed into the roof of a house, right? And no way it belongs up there, but allowing kids an opportunity to create a story which explains the picture. I mean, and the more we talked about as a class, the more we thought, you know what, whether you ever use the test or not, I don't know the value of the score and all that stuff, but just kind of emphasizing the importance of creativity and rewarding kids and encouraging kids to be creative, to allow their brains to create and be expressive. I think there's so much therapeutic value in that. That I don't know that we do that enough. Art teachers certainly do that for sure, and I hope music teachers
I
as
was
well,
just
not just playing the notes on this particular piece, but also allowing kids to be creative kind of with that as well. So I hope we're doing that more. There's certainly opportunity.
Well, and I was actually just going to say that further reinforces the need to continue pushing the arts in K
Oh
12
yeah,
education. You know
oh
what I
yeah,
mean? Like because that's where a lot of the passion comes from, which these kids are. They want to be artists, they want to be musicians, they want to be coding, they want to be doing these things, they want to be makers, they want to be doing. So we have to continually emphasize those things. And then we have to keep in mind, which we've talked a million times on the show about, the 4 skills that employers are looking for in the 21st century, right? Critical thinking, creative problem solving, communication skills, and the ability to collaborate. Those are the 4 critical skills. Now, on Friday, we just held our final 7th grade invite the parents in to see our kids' Rube Goldberg projects, group projects where they create Rube Goldberg machines. It's over. Why? Because we're rewriting the curriculum, and the curriculum that we've adopted and we're bringing in no longer has that. So we've just wiped out this big project that does collaboration, communication, critical thinking, and creative problem solving. Got rid of all that.
Oh,
I not saying the new curriculum is bad necessarily, but man, seems like a loss to me.
yeah.
And do we always have the right things at the forefront? So again, this is one we could talk for hours upon hours about.
Yeah.
Given all the different interchanges that are in this particular study of studies.
Yeah. We're all kind of living in this world, which is a global economy where we rely on innovation, right? Well, let's make sure
Yes,
we're encouraging that and providing opportunity for kids to be innovative. And yeah, look, I think there's a lot of teachers out there doing an excellent job at this, but I think it's
yes,
worthwhile for teachers and for parents and caregivers, right, to pause and say, how am I doing with that? Am I doing a good job with that? Could I do better? Are there other ways that I could kind of make sure I'm making time for unstructured creativity, right? And yeah, how else can I do this? So I think that's
yes.
part of the point here. Is not pointing fingers saying you're doing it wrong. So could we do this better, right? Could we do it better? Yeah.
Can we? It's a great question to always ask.
Yeah. Let me just give you some more statistics from the article. I just found it so fascinating. Different countries kind of are experiencing similar and different things. And this article will kind of walk through that a little bit. Even kind of the walking to school piece, right? I'm going to just mention kind of Stranger Things. Those kids rode their bikes to school, right? Well, that's changed. We don't allow kids to ride their, in general, we don't allow that in the United States, certainly not as much as we used to. And again, we say, well, safety, that's a good thing. We don't want them getting hit by a car. But are we, again, that decision, did it have an unintended consequence? And so we see similar things happening in other countries. So in England, we know that walking home alone from school dropped from 86% in 1971 to 35% of kids in 1990 to 25% of kids in 2010. Yeah. In the US, we dropped to 12% who walked or rode a bike to school, down from 73% in 1972.
Rick, with those
Go ahead.
with those stats right there, does it reference with those statistics anything about the geographic distance with those drops? You know what I mean?
No, it
Like a
doesn't say.
73% drop with. I'd be curious too with the how much the drops are precipitous to the distance from home to school.
That's a great point. Yeah, it doesn't dig that deep into the details here. It's interesting that Finland seems to do things a little bit differently. It tends to give kids the greatest freedom of movement maybe in the world. At age 7 now, a majority of Finnish kids can already travel to places within a walking distance or take their bike to places alone. By age 8, a majority can cross main roads, travel home from school, and go out after dark alone. By age 9, a majority can cycle on the main roads alone. And by age 10, a majority can travel on local buses alone. So we see Finland taking a very different kind of approach. And right, is it a coincidence that Finland is always near the top of the happiest countries in the world? I mean, you've probably seen some of those statistics as well. So I don't know. Is it a coincidence? It's certainly correlational data, but it's something to consider. Are there advantages to the way they're doing things, and is there anything we can beg, borrow, and steal from the way they're doing things to kind of help set our kids up for success?
Yeah, it's interesting, Rick, and I don't want to dovetail too far off topic, but we've been looking at Finland for us as far back, I would say probably 2010, back in my other old podcast days, and I have found it become increasingly more difficult to compare the United States to Finland, just in terms of size, government, and other things. But again, like you said, what can we cherry pick? What can we, what can we take from that research and, use to our advantage and benefit? And one of the things that I would point out would be if you look at the funding for education, in Finland versus what we do in the United States, that tells you everything you need to know right there. You know what I mean? Like we struggle to get $12 billion a year federally passed for education funding in the United States, and we're giving that monthly to the Ukraine and other military funding. Now, again, I'm not saying we should or shouldn't be doing that. I'm just making a comparison to what that looks like. And again, education publicly is funded at the state level and locally for the most part anyway, but just making some comparative points there.
Well, no, I think it's really important points that I'd repeat and emphasize, Nick. It's not like we want to become Finland Jr., right? Well, let's just do what they're doing, everything like that. When that's not the point. We're America. We do our own thing, and there are really great things about the way we do things. But that idea of cherry picking some of the things that they're doing to kind of make ourselves even better, right? Back to that good to great things. Are there things that specifically that they're doing that would also work for us and kind of give our kids even more advantage, specifically when it comes to mental health, because it's such a significant problem for us. There's my puppy. Sorry about that. Let me give you
Murray or
just
Sadie?
no, that's Sadie. I don't know what she's all worried about. Let me just give you a couple more pieces here, Nick. And this one is maybe something we all know, but again, just kind of emphasizes how important this is and how our kids are really at risk right now. The 2009 Youth Risk Survey revealed that during the previous year, so this would be during 2018, 19% of U.S. high school students seriously considered attempting suicide. That's almost 1 in 5. 15% made a suicide plan, and 9% attempted suicide one or more times. That's pre-COVID. That's pre-COVID, and we're pretty sure that things have gotten worse since then. So, yeah, again, this just continues to be a serious issue, which puts the health, mental and physical well-being of our students at risk. I want to pull 2 more pieces out of here, Nick, because I'm curious what you think about this. The time that our kids spend doing homework. This article kind of references that and how that has increased by 11 hours per week in general from 1981 to 2003. So this research is a little dated, but a lot more homework now than maybe when you and I were growing up in the 80s. We're giving kids a lot more homework. It's taking a lot more time. Advantages for sure. But again, the question is, are there disadvantages? And one final piece is something I didn't know that this article talks about. Between 1950 and 2010, the average length of the school year in the U.S. increased by 5 weeks. I didn't know that, which kind of shocked me a little bit. I guess I just figured, since 1850s, kids have been going to school for 180 days. And it's just kind of written into the Constitution or something. I had no idea that we've increased the number of days kids go to school. I don't know. That just kind of was fascinating to me.
Yeah, the homework thing is I don't want to talk much about that at all because that is very outdated. And I've always been on a very big anti-homework kick, but that kind of all went away after COVID because we, across the world, basically eliminated homework and it never really bounced back. And you would actually kind of find me probably on the other side of the fence now saying we probably need a little bit more. And I don't mean in the traditional sense of homework. I mean in the type of homework that has been found to have some research benefits, which is simply review and reinforcement. And that is only effective if there is some support at home to help that happen. So in a lot of the households where the students who need that extra support, we know that they don't get that because you have 2 parents who are working, or you only have 1 parent who's probably working multiple jobs, which makes it even less likely that the child can get the support they need to do that. So
even
again,
giving homework kind of could actually make the achievement gap even worse. Because the kids who
and that's one of the biggest
going to achieve more. The kids who actually need more help are not getting it. So yeah, interesting.
Yep. That's pretty much the that's the biggest argument against homework. And again, I talked earlier on that thing, watching teachers, at different points in teaching careers and different teachers at different levels of for lack of a better term, success. And some have the belief that, well, it's the student's responsibility to go home and be responsible, and they ignore all of the other factors that kind of go into that. And, when you really take a look at that research, it's pretty obvious what causes are behind a lot of the different correlations and factors that play into a lot of that. Now, that is an interesting point about the 180 days and whatnot, Rick. But also, there has recently been changes, at least in Pennsylvania, and I believe it's some of the federal ESEA standards as well, where it used to be either 180 days or a certain number of hours, and I think now it's either or. So there's more flexibility now, as there is now also post-COVID some they call it the flexible instructional days. That's become more incorporated into the school year as well. So there is a little bit more flexibility. However, which is funny because post-COVID, most people are realizing and saying, that flexible instruction stuff doesn't really work. So we really need kids, at least K-12. We need them in school, present physically in the seats to actually learn. So lots there. And I think in the next 10 years, we're going to see a ton of research, I think, that supports that.
Yeah, Nick, and that's a great point too. It gets at the heart of this kind of probably the argument against this article is saying, okay, we can give kids playtime. Are they going to use that constructively, right, or mindlessly, right, or dangerously, right, with idle time? Who knows what they're going to do? That's a great point. Is gosh, how do we give kids kind of enough structure to be productive, enough encouragement to be productive, but not hover? It's such a balance. The word that comes to mind is scaffolding, right? It's providing enough structure, but not leading too hard, right? But that's really, really easier said than done for sure.
Oh, again, no argument for me on that. And those are very, very gray areas that we all have to be, I think, very careful about, throwing stones in a glass house about.
Yeah. I even think of it in the process of counseling, Nick, that one of the things I'm always kind of talking with my counselors and training about is the importance of student buy-in, the importance of kids setting their own goals. Right, is not that we don't impose goals on kids, because that's not going to work. They're the ones who got to do it. They need to help kind of generate the goals and that they want to work for, because we're with them for 20 minutes every week at best, right? The rest of the time they're on their own. So they're either going to want to kind of accomplish something and work to accomplish the goals, or they're not. But those things they have to have some level of investment in order for them to make progress.
Yeah, and I know in this segment I've really it sounds like I've really kind of like railed against a certain mentality of teacher, as because I'm about to do it again. But this is administrators too, and counselors and everything else. Like also the notion that we can just expect these kids to come in and sit there for 50 minutes and listen to us. Those days are over too. You know what I mean? Like in terms of creative play and whatnot, we've got their attention for maybe 3 or 4 minutes. You know what I mean? Like for some direct instruction. That's all you've got. The average viewing length of a YouTube video is 3 seconds. 3 seconds. So these kids today can determine whether or not they want to consume the content of a YouTube video within 3 seconds. That's how fast they decide, right?
Yeah.
And we think they're going to sit and listen to us, old people, for 50 minutes? We got to get better at what we do, and we got to get better at how we do it. Or we have to change what we do entirely. And we know that that's not going to happen systemically in our lifetime. So, we have to work within the limitations of what we have to a large degree as well.
Yeah, and again, Nick, we could keep going on this, right? I'm just thinking about the importance of attention grabbers, right? At the beginning of a lesson, just so critical. Again, we could keep going, but we will, right? I mean, we'll kind of weave in our other thoughts into some of the other research. But this is such an interesting topic, and while the researchers didn't necessarily do their own kind of quantitative research on this, they kind of laid down kind of a model, a strong hypothesis with some good support from previously done research. And I think, future researchers hopefully will kind of pick up where they left off and, try to run some experiments, all right? Somewhat experimental and figure out, is this really happening, or what can we cherry pick that can make some improvements, or how do we provide more freedom while also kind of making sure kids are safe, and give us some additional pointers, because as a parent, I need it. I need help. How do I do that as a parent for my kids? Do I give them more freedom, but also make sure that time they're going to spend constructively? So, yeah, good stuff.
The important thing is they're asking the questions, right? Yeah. Which I really feel like that's so important in and of itself.
Yeah.
All right. Well, whew. We'll be back at it again, talking these topics and more on Rick and Nick's Excellent Adventure. Thanks for tuning in, and why don't you pop on over to the website, ExcellentEdVenture.com. We'd appreciate it.